First of all, I'll introduce our lovely guest, Rebecca Stirnemann. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello.
Ken, I've got you down as the Central North Island Regional Manager for Forest and Bird. That's quite and you're a doctor, of course. That's quite a big job.
Yeah. I look after the Waikato, the Bay of Plenty, and Gisborne. So it's quite an exciting area and includes this frog area, or a key frog area, I guess.
Exactly. People always like to know how you get an amazing job like yours, where you're doing not only a job with a big organisation like that, but also you're so involved in the conservation space on a personal level too. So just briefly, how did you get to be where you are?
I suppose I studied a lot at university and gained a few degrees. And then while I was doing that, I started working on different conservation projects around the world, including I suppose when I did my PhD, it was in the Pacific Islands and then mostly in Samoa. But then I also was invited to go do research in like Nauru and New Caledonia and other Pacific Island countries. And of course, I always came back to New Zealand in between, and Australia too, and did work and research on some of our species. So it's been really exciting to work in that space. But then because I'd helped establish an NGO in the Pacific, I wanted to get the experience of working with a really good and big NGO here in New Zealand. And the oldest is Forest and Bird, which is nearly going to turn 100, I think, in a couple of years.
Really?
So, yeah, it's got its birthday coming up. And it's achieved a lot of things. So I wanted to work for one of the best conservation organisations that we have, but also our oldest. So to get to learn from some of the best campaigners about how you transfer a lot of the science into conservation action on the ground, and then make sure that all of it gets linked up. So so I've been doing that for it's going towards 3 years now. Yeah.
So I'm just going to sit back now. And you've got the presentation. Excite us about frogs. We'd love to hear.
Well, I suppose, where should I start? I'll start from the beginning. And I suppose these are some of New Zealand's frogs. We had more, but unfortunately they've disappeared. There's someone who's doing some work on their fossils at the moment, on the ones which have disappeared, to try and figure out what they used to look like and stuff. But these are the 4 species of frogs that we have left. In the corner there, we've got Hochstetters. Well, and I'll tell you a bit about all of them. And I've been lucky enough to see a couple of these, but yeah, they're actually quite tricky to see in New Zealand. They're quite cryptic, and that New Zealand's frogs are really different from frogs around the rest of the world. We've got some quite, I suppose some people might call them primitive, but maybe I'd say more dinosaur-esque frogs, and they're a little bit odd, but in a special way. So we've got the Hochstetters there in the corner. I don't know if you can see my arrow. That's this guy here on the far left top. And they occur in the half of the North Island in the top bit. And they are a small brown frog. Both Archies and Hochstetters are the 2 smaller frogs that we have. Archies is the smallest of them all. And then the Mauds and the Hamilton are slightly bigger. The Hamilton frog is the rarest frog in the world. There's maybe about 300 or less than 300 of them left. They used to occur all the way from the Waikato all the way down, but now they're only on Stevens Island, which is in the Cook Strait. So they're left on this tiny little island, though Doc has been trying to move them around to put them in a few other places to try and get them back. And yeah, they're endangered because there's so few of them left, and they're really affected by predation. So that's one of the reasons why they've disappeared in our mainland, and which is a massive shame. Then we've got the Maud Island frog. Until recently, they were only on Maud Island, but Doc's also translocated, which means, if you don't know, they've been grabbing some and then moving them around and trying to establish another population. And that's really important, because if you can establish a new population, if something happens to the other population, it means that there'll be some which is still safe. So it's like making safe populations. And they're doing that in some predator-free islands. They're considered nationally endangered. Like a lot of our frogs, they're nocturnal, and there's still a lot we have to learn about them. Like, for instance, they've never been seen breeding in the wild, though there has been one guy and he's seen them lay some eggs. They lay between 1 to 16 eggs, and the male does a lot of the work. And that's true of a lot of our frogs, and I'll go into that. They're a bit like kiwis, where it's the same thing, where the female kiwi, she lays the massive egg, which I've been lucky enough to go collect kiwi eggs in the wild for translocation purposes, and they're about this big, and the male kiwi sits on them and he cares for the kiwi egg. But it's the same with a lot of our frogs, where the female lays the eggs and then the male, he's the caretaker, I guess. So he does all the paternal care, which is pretty awesome and very modern of these old frog species. So that, and some of these frogs are absolutely tiny. Like the Archie's is he is less than 38 millimeters in size, and they're really cryptic and hard to see. So lots of people will never see one of these frogs, but if you know where to look, you can sometimes go see them. Or I think there might be some groups where you can go visit them as well, with a breeding program for Archies. So there's a few in captivity you can visit, and sometimes if you're really lucky, you can go see them in the wild too. So Archie's is restricted to 2 areas. I'll show you where on a map in a sec. And they are interesting frogs because they only occur like 400 to 1,000 meters up in a mountain, so up in the mountain areas. So these are not, they're not all typical frogs in terms of, in many ways, and I'll show you why now. One of the scary things about Archies is there used to be a lot more of them. Not only, and it's even within recent times that we've seen this massive crash in their population, with declines of up to 88% since 1996. So there's been a massive change in their population, and they're not doing as well as they could be. So we need to improve things for the Archies in particular, but all of these frogs. So this is a frog you might have seen in New Zealand, and you might have been like, yeah, I've seen frogs, native frogs around New Zealand. In fact, I've seen them in ponds and fish tanks and all sorts of places, but this is not a New Zealand frog. This is an Australian. It's an Australian bell frog. And it's much more of a, I suppose, your stereotypical frog species, and that, like a lot of frogs, it starts out as a tadpole, and then they start to grow their legs, and then they have a tadpole tail and legs, and then they become a froglet and they're a frog. But, oops, our frogs are different. Oops, what is it? Before I go into that, though, of how they're different, this is the habitat of the Hochstetters on the top. See, they like these kind of like streams with a nice little streamy bit with some nice rocks and in native forest. But Archies, they are a bit different from, because people associate frogs with rivers and water. But Archies, he lives in a really damp foresty area under rocks and punga bits and stuff. He doesn't even necessarily live near a stream, and they'll only move like a couple of meters in their whole lives. So they live like a very small, quiet existence high up in the mountains, not near streams. So quite different from a lot of places. And if you look at that map of New Zealand there, and you can see those little black dots, that's the only places where Archies are left. So we've got one area near Tekawiti, and then some areas in the Coromandel. So the Coromandel forests are really, really important for Archies. And I'll tell you what we need to do to help Archie's frogs in the future. So we'll go over what's causing these declines and what we can do about it, and how we can help Hochstetters and other species too, because I suppose that's one of the things as conservationists all of us can actually work towards. So here we have Archie's. He's one of these critically endangered species. And these things are rarer than kiwis. So kiwis are common compared to these frogs. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind. And here we have on the corner, Mr. Archie's frog, and he's got there a pile of eggs which are growing into tadpoles. And unlike that bell frog from Australia, all of the tadpole stage is inside the egg. And so Mr. Archie, let me just see, I wrote down the times. Okay, so they don't have a tadpole, unlike other frogs, and it takes 2 months for those eggs to develop. And so that entire time, after Mrs. Archie, she leaves the eggs with him and she hops off. He will be in charge of the egg collection, and he will take the secretions from his body and lovingly secrete himself around each egg. And he'll like kind of like take some and rub them up. A bit of like frog urine is quite apparently a good thing for this, and that's used to reduce the mold, we think, on the eggs. So it keeps the eggs in top-notch conditions, probably adds a bit of hormones to help in their development. So he's in charge of like a cleaning business, and he does it for 2 months. So if you've been in lockdown, he's in lockdown every year, but for longer than most people are, apart from, I suppose, well, longer than everybody in New Zealand has been, I guess. So he's been secreting himself, and then that's just the first 2 months. After he's done his 2 months of secreting, then these little frogs hatch into froglets. So they'll be like, have all their legs and a little tail, and then they hop onto dad, and they do that for 1 more month. I'll just show you what they look like. Oh, there we go. Here's Mr. Frog. And that you'll see them, and these little froglets will be climbing over his eyeballs and his face, and it's like quite high childcare at this time. And that's for another month. So we've got 3 months of childcare under a rock. It's quite intense for the male frog. Yeah, or like I now like to think of it as 3 months of lockdown under a punga. So and he will have up to 4 to 15 froglets clinging to him like this and developing. And Auckland Zoo, they decided that they would have a go trying to be a male frog, male Archie's frog, because of course Auckland Zoo's trying to help and save these frogs, these Archie's frog. And they were like, well, if there's only so many male frogs, we'll step in and we'll help with the childcare. And now we can watch this little video and see, so you can see what they look like. And one of the things, so here they are, that Auckland Zoo, here's Auckland Zoo trying to mimic male frogs, and they had to put a male frog in a plastic bag and with a bit of water and collect the secretions and have a go. And it took them quite a while to work out how to do it. And see, you can see how tiny they are. One of the weird things about Archies is, unlike other frogs, they don't use a long tongue to like lick up the see, he jumps towards the food, and instead of licking it with putting his tongue out and projectile catching his food, he'll just leap forward and use his mouth to feed. And that's quite different from other frogs as well. Yeah, so that's one of the weird things about Archie. So they're kind of like an interesting frog in that way. Another thing that's really interesting about them is, and in fact this is true for all of New Zealand frogs, is you'll never hear a New Zealand frog croaking. If you hear a frog croaking in New Zealand, it's a bell frog. Those Australians again. And our frogs will only make a chip or a yelp if they're annoyed. So if they get a little bit too harassed, they will chip or yelp at you, but they won't croak, and they can't. And we think that maybe they are communicating instead using chemo signals, which is like what you get in salamanders, which is another little reptile. So instead they're using chemicals to communicate with each other. Well, unless they're very, very annoyed. So they're using other ways to have a chat, and that's pretty exciting. The other thing is that they're mostly nocturnal. So if you combine all these factors, the fact that they're tiny, the fact that they're quite cryptic and brown for the most part, and that they don't croak, you can see how a lot of people have like overlooked them, I guess. Yeah, and also the other thing is, if they get scared by a predator, unlike other frogs which will try and jump away and escape, they just sit still and they just freeze and they don't move at all. So, which is also quite interesting. Like, they like their little spot and they'll live there for ages. So yeah, they're a very exciting frog. I've been very excited when I've come across them. I suppose we should get to why they're disappearing now that you've learned a lot about our native frogs. And I suppose the reason isn't to tell you about what's happening, is not only, so I suppose to gain an understanding of what you can do about it, because in order to keep our frogs, we all need to like take some action. And if you look at this picture of New Zealand, those green bits are our forests, which are disappearing. And as you can see, there's less and less forest. And particularly if you look at our North Island, where a lot of these frogs are, like you can see that they've just resulted in this being in this Coromandel area and lower down, because so much of our forests have disappeared, and our last little remnants of forests are disappearing at quite a high rate even now. In fact, I could say that we are currently still in New Zealand losing more of our natural areas than we're gaining through replanting. So we're still on that downward slide, and that's something that we still need to step up and deal with. The other thing is these guys. Like, of course, a frog makes a tasty snack, and a frog that just sits there and looks slightly alarmed is very easy access. We know that when you've got rats, they have an impact. Possums have an impact. Pigs like to eat a few of our frogs, and of course hedgehogs. So hedgehogs, you might think, oh, they just eat milk and bread, but in fact they're actually a voracious predator, and they will climb trees and eat our baby birds as well. So all of these species have been introduced to New Zealand, and sadly are having big impacts, and that includes on our native frogs and their habitat. So that's one issue. And then of course we've got this. So this is less of a problem for Archie's, because he's not reliant on the waterways. But though there's a big roaring streams in this picture, the water that Hochstetter needs is really has to be high quality, and it has to be good, nice water. And so when our waterways get more polluted, we start to lose these species. And also if we have a lot of stock or stock as in cattle or sheep in our waterways, they can also trod and move the rocks, and then these frogs get squashed. So it's also about making sure that our waterways improve. And unfortunately, especially in the Waikato, we've got some really dirty water areas. So that's something we need to change. We want to improve our waterways and make sure that everything starts to get better rather than get worse. And that will help frogs like Hochstetters survive as well. But, oh yeah, before I go into the good news, but we have another issue too, and that is gold mining. And this is a big problem, particularly in the Coromandel at the moment, where we've got, remember, that really important area for Archies. And unfortunately, even at the moment, there is prospecting, which means people are looking for gold in areas on conservation land for where the Archie's frog is. And that's really, really concerning, because these frogs are really, really fragile. There's so few areas left, and yet New Zealand is still allowing people to look at doing gold mining on conservation land. And that's areas which are set aside for conservation and for our endangered species. And yet we're starting to be greedy, I guess, and say, we want to make big holes in the ground. We want to dig out gold bars, and people want to mine and get money, and I suppose jobs as well, in areas where these sorts of species occur. So I suppose to a certain extent, we're going to have to make a choice of, are we going to support this increase in extraction of gold and potentially some more jobs with it, or are we going to preserve the last of these amazing little species? And personally, I think we've got enough gold stored in banks around the world, and we don't really need more. It's just shiny. I think this little guy is a little bit more exciting. So stopping gold mining in conservation areas is a really key thing that we want to do so that we can maintain our amazing little frogs. And then hopefully we all get to see one, because they're pretty exciting. Weird, but exciting. Okay, now for the good news, because that's a little bit sad, you know, like that mining's having that sort of impact. I suppose this is the good news, is that in a few areas, some of our frogs are doing better. And this is where I've been really, really lucky, because I've got to go see some of these areas. And one of them is in Mangatautri. If you haven't done a visit to Mangatautri, it's near Cambridge, and it is a mountain which has a predator-free fence around it. And you can, that's this picture on the corner here. And the fence goes all the way around this mountain. It's all native forest, and it's absolutely brilliant. And not only have species like kōkako and kiwi gone up and increased, but they've also been really excited to find, unbeknownst to them, that there were frog species in there and gecko species they didn't know existed. And those species have all started to do way better, because that area has got rid of all their predators. There's no hedgehogs, there's no stoats, there's no possums or rats in there. And everything's doing better. And the frogs that are there, which is the Hochstetters, are doing way, way better. The other place where this has occurred, where we've seen this increase in frog numbers, is in the Hanuas. And there, instead of having a fence, they use 1080 bait. 1080 is a type of poison which is used to kill invasive species, if you don't know that. And it's been really effective in killing these species which have been predating the frogs. And as a result, the frogs in the waterways, these frogs who are so reliant on clean water and would be actually really affected by this poison if it had an impact, have actually skyrocketed. So instead, we've lost the pests and the frogs are doing way better. So in the Hanuas, because of this 1080 drop, we're seeing this massive increase in frogs, which is just really exciting. And I was also lucky enough, at the same time as I went frog hunting over there, to also see, to be involved with taking a kōkako chick out of its nest to put a little ring around its foot for research, and then it went back into its nest. And their population has also boomed, and they are doing so well there, and that was also really, really exciting. And and kōkako chicks, in case you didn't know, they have pink wattles. So like where the adults are blue, they're bright pink, and it was absolutely awesome to see that. And then after that, we went and looked at the frogs and found a few. I don't know if you saw the picture I sent around with a little froglet on my friend's finger, but you can see how small these things are. And they're doing really well there. So that's really exciting. The other frog trip, which I've recently been involved in, was, gone backwards by accident, is here. And this is on Huturu, or Little Barrier. And I was involved with a group who had the amazing opportunity to go to Little Barrier and go looking for frogs. And we were looking for Hochstetters over there because we're hoping to find another population of frogs. Unfortunately, we didn't find any frogs on Little Barrier, even though we looked under every single rock, I swear, on that island, and it was quite steep, and through every stream. We didn't find any frogs, but now it gives the opportunity, I guess, to introduce our native frogs to this predator-free island. And I have to say, if you're ever lucky enough to go to an island like this in New Zealand, you get to see what New Zealand used to look like. There were kōkako jumping around the lawn. There were kiwis, which, like, you could trip over a kiwi. There were so many. There were tuataras just wandering around the ground, all over the place. And kakapo as well, booming at night. So it's a magical place, and it'd be great to have our frogs back there as well. So I suppose this is maybe one of our frog sites of the future, where frogs could be brought back. And that's what I think Doc is looking at the moment, is that opportunity, and see if that could happen. But in the meantime, I guess, really, we all need to, I suppose, consider what we can do for frogs in New Zealand. And there is a few things. One is we can call on the government and ask them to stop mining in our conservation estate. That will help Archies in particular. And I suppose there's a few ways we can do that. we could write to Jacinda directly and tell her how important our frogs are, and tell her we want to keep them, and that mining is having an impact, and we don't need more gold, but we do need more Archies. We could also tell her that we need cleaner rivers, because cleaner rivers will result in more Hochstetters, and it will mean that the ones who are there won't do worse. And then, of course, we need more pest control, especially in froggy areas, because frogs really respond well to pest control. So, yeah, those are some of the things we can do. But, yeah, you'd be amazed how much governments respond to a few letters from us in the public, us telling them what needs to happen, because it's really, really important. So a letter can make a big difference. You'd be surprised. Yeah, and I suppose that's, oh yeah, and you can also go out and do pest control yourself. So go out there and actually get rid of some of those bad species which are eating our frogs. That's the other thing. And if you can and ever get the chance to see any of our native frogs, oh, they're glorious and weird little things. And I'd recommend going to some of the places where we have groups like Auckland Zoo who are working to increase populations and get them back out there. Even though I still think that Archie's male frog does a really good job on his own, and it was hard from the people I've spoken to replicate his job. They have done an amazing job having a go. Yep, that's it. And that is my talk, Nick.
Oh, that's brilliant. Are there any potential hidden spots still in New Zealand where some of these frogs could be, or do you think you've got them down? You know, are there any places you just haven't been able to get to yet that they could be?
Oh, there's still, they're pretty secretive, these little frogs. So yeah, they could be in some places we don't know where they are yet. We can hope that they're in new places, and every now and then they do find Hochstetters in a new stream. So every now and then, but yeah, especially Archies. Yeah, so some of them potentially, and I still have a little bit of hope. Maybe we'll find some of the species which have gone extinct, and we'll find a tiny little population. And it's called the Lazarus effect when that happens as well. When you do pest control in an area, and this is a good example in Mangatautari, you do pest control in an area, and then suddenly species you thought were extinct or weren't there, locally extinct, suddenly reappear like magic. And wow. You know, that's pretty exciting. It doesn't happen if you're starting, I suppose, restoring a place from scratch, because, you know, then everything's gone. But in an area like Mangatautari, which was an old established forest, you do intensive pest control, and if there's like some frogs clinging on there with the last little fingers to that area and the last few, then they might come back. And then, of course, there's always the option, which Doc is looking into and is doing some work on, is translocation. And yeah, and I'm hopeful in the future we'll see Archies in more areas as well, and we'll see kakapo wandering around with Archies. Like, that would be amazing to bring kakapo back to the mainland. I've heard there's some discussion of that from Mangatautari, so that would be very exciting. And yeah, and then yeah, that would be amazing. It would be so cool to be able to see them more easily and to have them back everywhere where they should have been. And it might have really cool impacts. Maybe it will help certain, you know, they eat flies, like Archies eat flies, so maybe it will then restore balance, because in areas like Yellowstone in America, when they took wolves out and then they put them back in, it changed the ecosystem in a good way. You got a different balance come back. And it was the same in there was another island, what was it called again? There's an island, somewhere overseas, there's an island where they also had removed giant tortoises, and they took a different giant tortoise and plonked it back on the island. And even though it was a bit different, all of these species on the island had evolved to be eaten by these giant tortoises. And therefore, when he was back and he was pooping them out, a different species of tortoise, these plants did well suddenly. So sometimes you need certain species, and it will make the when you bring them back or something very similar back, you can restore the ecosystem.
And these translocations, someone did ask if there had been any successful Archie's frog translocations, but I take it they haven't yet.
There might. I know that Doc was working on one, and I'm not too sure how successful it was yet. And I think the other thing with translocations is you have like a lot of individuals for a while, because you can't, like, you have to have a certain number go there, and then you have to add more. So even determining what a success is can take quite a while, just because through random events, you can, like, you put 10 there, you can just lose them. And sometimes their species are quite attached to wherever they're from, like long-tail bats, for instance. They're quite hard to translocate because they like home, and they will go back home unless you move a juvenile. So it's, you know, certain species just are homebodies, I guess, and they pine for their home if you move them. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. Dylan asked, what about Hochstetter frogs in the Dome Valley? Any idea what is going to happen there with the tip? Does that ring a bell with you at all? Yes,
I have heard about that, and I have to say I'm quite concerned about those little guys. Like, they're quite sensitive to chemicals, and like, though they say that they're gonna, like, contain it, I'd say that's something, yeah. We only have so many frogs and so many frogs left, and those frogs, that would be a sticking point for me about whether that dump should go there or not. And personally, I'm thinking we need to start looking at better systems rather than just dumping it down a hole and burying it, because we can see that we're resulting already in problems because of that around. And well done on the Minister for Conservation, Eugenie, because she's done really well with starting to look at different ways we can get rid of waste. And I've noticed that different councils are doing the same now, bringing up more green bins and, like, making sure that everyone starts to recycle vegetable materials. So we can also help in that way. But, like, yeah, I personally don't think we should be putting toxic dumps near our frog habitats. They're a bit more sensitive.
You're so enthusiastic about what you do, and you've been doing it for quite some time. And so obviously you must have ways of reconnecting with your passion in saving these species. Any ways you can help others that are going through, you know, a time where they're working really hard as a community group and they just want to keep focused? Any thoughts? How do you do that, do you reckon?
I think it's worth taking a step back from your, like, local project and going to one of our amazing areas in New Zealand, and I'd recommend Mangatautari or Tiri areas which have, or Great Barrier as well. That was quite amazing. Areas where we've had success and things are coming back to how they were, or like Puriora, where we have our old forest still. And I'd go and visit them and just walk around there and remember what we're aiming for when we do this kind of restoration work. And because though it's exciting to see that in a lot of areas, tuis are coming back and kaka and some and things like that, it's good to know how far we can push that edge. And for me, having our frogs back, but also having our seabirds back is one of those key things. And yeah, that's why actually I recommend a trip to Great Barrier around in the summer or up to any time before April, because then you can go stay in the huts up there, and at night go out and go for a wander and experience our black petrels and our Cook's petrels coming in. And that is something which is so amazing, and it's like one of those touching moments. And those are the moments that we need as conservationists to go experience, to give us the energy to continue the fight, and to fight in so many ways, like everything from doing the pest control to going out and asking our politicians to change, or asking our councils to do some changes, and then doing our changes ourselves on, you know, even recycling and everything like that. Like getting out there and seeing what we're trying to save is so critical. And yeah, and New Zealand we're so lucky. We have some of these really amazing spots. So,
quite a science question. What is the genetic diversity of the different populations of frogs? Is there any diversity, and is DOC considering mixing populations?
That's an interesting one. So I'm not too sure how much diversity there is. I do know that particular species do better. I suppose here's an example. Sometimes we talk a lot about genetic diversity, and some species do quite well with even low genetic diversity. One example is your cheetah, you know, the fastest cat in the world. And they are so genetically similar, every single cheetah, that you can take a skin graft from one cheetah and put it on a different cheetah and it will accept it. so even some species with that sort of low diversity do well anyway. And some species are frankly weird. Like there's some gecko species, for instance, and they don't sexually reproduce. They clone themselves. So there you'll have very low genetic diversity. And because frogs are so different from us, that we can have to think of them in a different way. Things that, so some of the genetic diversity thing is true. Oops.
I'm just going to put you across to here.
Oh, that's way better. So sometimes the genetic diversity, we can think that that's a bigger problem than it is. And in reality, it'll be other things which are a bigger issue, like, for instance, our invasive pests. And that's a real issue that we need to tackle. Or the competition for resources, such as what are we keeping, our gold or our frogs? Or what are we digging out of the ground? And I suppose we don't need to think so much about genetic diversity if the population is wiped out by a gold mine or some sort of other, or having dirty water. So, yeah, it's a long answer.
No, good answer. No, good answer, and good questions coming. Here's one probably from a school kid. Can you touch one of these frogs if you see them?
Well, yeah, like, so you have to be careful because some of them don't like to be touched, but I have picked up a Hochstetters before and held it on my hand, and they're absolutely tiny. So if you're with someone who knows how to handle a frog, then maybe, yeah. Or you can talk to the zoo people, and I don't know if they let you hold one. But basically, it's good to have a conservationist who know how to handle these sorts of critters, because sometimes they can be not very happy. And because there's so few left, yeah, we have to be a bit careful. Yeah, but they are pretty exciting and they are pretty adorable. They have big round eyes instead of slitty eyes like most frogs. They're quite cute.
How will climate change impact them?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I suppose if things depends what happens with climate change, because we still have to determine which things will alter. I suppose we need to have a certain amount of rainfall for Archies because they like to live in damp areas, and we need to be able to maintain our forests, and those forests can also be impacted by changes in temperature and things like that. So we need to make sure that our temperatures aren't going to wipe out our forests, and that the rainfall is going to be enough to keep them damp. And yeah, climate change is a really worrying thing, but I suppose that's the next thing on the worry. But first we have to tackle invasive species, gold mine, and dirty rivers, and then climate change. We have to tackle climate change as well. Like it's the big tricky one, but yeah. It is something we need to do for all of our species, but also for ourselves, because, yeah.
But you're gaining your army for frogs, which is really good. People for frogs. You're increasing numbers all the time of people. Somebody asked, what are their natural predators if you take out the introduced predators?
Oh, that's a really good question. Sometimes it's surprising who knows, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to it. So it'd be good if someone did some research on that, but it could be, sometimes it's surprising. Like Weka, for instance, will take a kiwi egg if they get the chance. Maybe a moorpork or something like that, or who knows, maybe a kiwi, but yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not too sure, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
That's all right, though. You've got to get a question every now and then. It's a really good. What is the benefit of the males spending so much time raising the young?
Oh, I just think the female has arranged a really good deal. And, it could also be a hormone thing. It could be that because his secretions are so important, it could be that he's providing the hormones and he's lovingly juicing up those eggs with his hormones. So maybe it has to be his job. It's like with some species, the female has to do it because she produces the milk. Maybe he has to produce the secretions. But either way, it's become his job in the same way that it's become the male kiwi's job. So you could just say New Zealand's really forward thinking. Modern.
Modern, yes. Karen's asked, would tuatara prey on native frogs?
Oh, yeah, actually, they probably could. Like, they do eat their own young, so I wouldn't be surprised if given the chance. Yeah, I suppose they haven't been occurring in the same area for a while now, so at the moment it's not even like close to a problem. But maybe it's something that has to be considered if you put them in the same area. And yeah, so possibly, I wouldn't be surprised.
Why do they freeze when they sense danger?
I think it's just an old behavioral trait of, like, maybe whatever predator which was native that was going for them couldn't see them if they went really still, or maybe they just, it's a little bit like that game, you know, like when you're like, you know, playing hide and seek, if sometimes if you're really still, you know, you can get away with it. But also because they so it could be because they're not hoppers too. Yeah.
Oh, right. And probably the final one, are there any native frogs in any of our cities?
Well, apart from that one, I suppose nearer to Auckland, there's an area near Tauranga which has some frogs, so but not in them. So that I've heard anyway. So mostly they're, and like especially Archie's, it's forested areas. So unless we've got some good forested areas, or if you've got a bit of forested area in your town or city. Who knows? Maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. One of the last one here is, what does the female Archie frog do while the male is doing all the childcare?
She's just probably hopping around looking for flies. Who knows? Maybe she's finding another male to have another like childcare experience with. And it could mean that this is why they do a little bit. It could help them a little bit that they're on the lookout for more partners.
Yes, yeah. Oh, you're being fantastic. Your passion comes across so well for what you do, and it is great to know frogs much better. They sound, like you say, they sound very adorable.
Yes. I recommend anyone who's near one of those places with breeding centres pops by. I know that you can go see Maud somewhere as well. I haven't got to see a Maud yet, but one of my colleagues, she saw one and she was telling me, she said they were quite cool. Yeah, so I can, so far I only know that Auckland Zoo definitely has some, but there'll be other places too. So maybe do some Googling and find out where you can see a frog, or maybe there'll be a point where there'll be enough of them that we can even do tours and do frog tours.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. How can we get in touch with you? How can people send you an email or something like that if they were to spot one or have any information that's really interesting?
Oh, I can pass my email out. It is r and then my last name @gmail.com. So I could type it into the message thing. Should I do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jessie from Predator Free New Zealand Trust, who's here today, has said that Zealandia have some on their night tour.
Oh, yes. I'd recommend that people then do a Zealandia night tour, because that would be pretty exciting. Yeah, to see one of the most prehistoric frogs that exist.
Wow.
Yep. Thanks for that, Jessie. That's good to know. It makes me now want to visit Zealandia.
Have you not done it yet? Have you not done one of those night tours?
No. I'm going to add it to my list, though.
Oh, good. No, it would be lovely. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. And what then is your next thing ahead now that we're out of lockdown, etc.? Where are you moving on to next? What's your next project as the Central North Island Regional Manager of Forest and Bird?
Well, I have been recently asked to go to Samoa. So once those doors open again, I will be going there to look at helping with translocation of an endangered bird from one place to another place. So that would be really cool if that happens. Or, so conservation. There's so many opportunities with conservation. So, yeah, it's very exciting.
It's been great. It is exciting, Rebecca. Thanks so much for your time and your lovely energy, and we'll see you out there, and bring on the frogs, I say. Bring more and more frogs.
Yes. Everyone should go out now and see frogs.